All right, so I'm recording now. Okay, so welcome everyone to our second PSIR faculty lecture. We have a new faculty member speaking today, Dr. Matthew Millard. He'll be speaking on secret alliances. The format of this talk is, our speaker will talk for somewhere around 30 to 45 minutes. And then at the end of that period, we'll open the floor up to questions. If you would prefer putting a question in the chat, that's fine. If you're comfortable speaking and asking the question aloud, that's totally fine too. We'll keep this relatively informal. So for those who just joined, we are recording this and we'll be posting it up on the website. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to our speaker.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. Sorry about presenting this virtually. There's probably going to be a few hiccups along the way since, of course, doing things virtually always seems to be more difficult. But the paper that I'm going to be presenting today is one that I've been working on for some time with a former graduate student of mine at St. Louis University. And it's gone through several different versions of the paper. And we're about the third version or so now, and I actually am doing some revisions right now to send it out for publication within, hopefully, by January, maybe February. But let's start with the riddle. So a case for any of you who might be interested in history, or of course all of you who are interested in political science, that we're all aware of is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Of course, this is a secret alliance, or well, a public and a secret alliance that was signed 9 days before the invasion of Poland in September 1st, 1939. And of course, here you see a picture of Molotov and Ribbentrop in the background directly behind him, and then of course Stalin more to the right side of the screen. What's unusual about this, though, is that we know, of course, that it was in public a non-aggression treaty. From day one, it was reported in Soviet press and American press, British press, German press, that there had been an alliance made between the Soviets and the Nazis. And this case has become even more relevant even within the past year or two, with kind of spats going back and forth between the European Union and Vladimir Putin, kind of with finger pointing as who started World War II, right? And with the European Union even trying to assign blame to this agreement as starting World War II. But we know also now that there were 3 secret protocols. We didn't know it at the time, and actually we didn't know until the war was virtually over that there were 3 secret protocols. And what's unusual about this is anyone with even an elementary understanding of history knows that even before World War II broke out, the 2 states were fundamentally incompatible. The Soviets, of course, were a communist state. The Nazi Germany was a National Socialist state. Hitler had written, and we know for a fact that Stalin had read Mein Kampf, but he had written about how he had wanted to conquer lands in the East for German expansion, so-called Lebensraum, right? So that illustrates a puzzle. Why would these 2 states that are so fundamentally different make an alliance with one another? Well, what I'm going to argue, kind of as a spoiler alert, is that secret alliances are fundamentally about a provision of some good, some material thing against a targeted other, a non-member to the alliance. So states are, of course, then incentivized to keep quiet in order to get that good, because if you broadcast what it is that you're after, the costs or what you're trying to get, the good itself, is so high that it's surely going to result in conflict. But we know that states or that alliances can do a couple of different things. First of all, we know that they can signal within there's signaling that goes on within alliances, right? We know from like what Morrow has told us that information is conveyed through alliances, namely about the values, the levels of commitment, the specifics of the relationship, under which agreement or what scenarios will we defend you, or will offensive war occur, et cetera, right? And this is where that debate on credible commitments and the credible commitments literature comes in. How much are states saying that, yes, we will back you, and here's proof that we're going to back you, right? This can help explain the presence of 28,000 US troops in South Korea right now, right? It's a credible commitment saying we're putting our troops here to show that we're really invested in you as South Korea are the United States ally. But of course, we know that different alliances do different things and they convey different information. Right? This is the whole reason why the Alliance Treaty and Obligation Provision dataset was developed in the early 2000s. We know, for instance, a defensive alliance sends different signals than an offensive alliance, right? Or different signals than a consultation or non-aggression pact. A defensive agreement, when backed up by credible commitment, should be enough to deter a foe, whereas an offensive agreement does something different, right? And that begs the question, kind of as a corollary to all of this, are secret alliances different? Are they different than these public alliances? Do they do different things, right? So we know also, though, that secret alliances can send different signals about the level of commitment. Carson and Yari Milo, in their 2017 article, look at the U.S. expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia as a way to signal to the South Vietnamese allies, hey, look, we really support you. Here's how much we support you. We're willing to expand the war into another state, albeit along a kind of porous border. But that's an interesting puzzle, right? If one of the main signal or one of the goals of alliances is to signal, how do we explain secret alliances where oftentimes that public signal is removed? Well, that's where coordination comes in, right? Secret or alliances also can be about coordination. They can be ways of coordinating troops, policies, aligning interests, variety of different things that they can coordinate between one another. And we maintain ultimately that secret agreements are coordinating these divisions of goods. But if one only need to look at history in order to understand how coordination can go within secret alliances. For instance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about at the end of the talk here in about 20 minutes or so. We know that there were 3 secret provisions to it that had to deal with the division of Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia, which at the time was a part of Romania. We also know now about the Treaty of London, which of course was between Triple Entente and Italy, essentially as a way to bribe the Italians to come in on the sides of the Western Allies during the First World War and to defect from their other agreements that they had with the Central Powers. By giving them territory and funds to Italy. And then, of course, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is an interesting one. And this is, of course, involved the division of the Middle East between the British and the French spheres of influence after the Ottomans were going to be defeated in the First World War. But there's not been a lot of quantitative work done on secret alliances for a variety of different reasons that I won't get into here. But that I do get into more within the paper. There's been some more formal work and qualitative work done on secret alliances using, there's even been some qualitative work done on secret alliances that stem from the Alliance Treaty and Obligation Provisions data sets, which of course is quantitative. But as I mentioned previously, Carson and Yari Milo tell us that leaders can use covert action to signal to other states their level of commitment to policy. So we call this offstage signal, right? And Carson, in his 2010 paper, tells us that secret alliances are going to be more likely when the cost of public alliances are high and the conflict probability is higher. So between 2 states that might not have good views of each other and they have strong domestic publics, it might make more sense to have a secret alliance. And in fact, we see this in some cases with the agreement between Swaziland and South Africa in 1981, I believe it was, in which case you had white South Africa, of course, during apartheid, making an agreement with an enfranchised population, largely within Swaziland, a Black Native African population. So they couldn't be seen to have too close of a relationship publicly, even though relations during apartheid were pretty good between those 2 states. Bass and Shub, in an interesting article, tell us that secret alliances provide asymmetric information, so unequal information, and thus give false optimism of a state's strength. And because these states have proprietary information, if you will, information that the other side doesn't have, they claim that it's going to increase the probability of conflict. We know, of course, that information plays an important role within conflict, right? This was the point that Leeds was making when she and some others started the ATOP data set in the early 2000s. This is the point Fearon makes in his 95 article, Van Evera in his 99 article, or book, I believe, on the origin of alliances. But when we look at Fearon in the context of how information can affect conflict, we know that there's a couple of things going on, right? He tells us conflict can happen when there's private information, right? What Bass and Shub are arguing, that private information makes conflict more likely. But we also know that this conflict can happen when there are commitment problems, right? When one can't commit to the other in a bargaining arrangement and ends up defecting, right? The prisoner's dilemma game. And then the other is issue indivisibilities. Some issues just don't lend themselves well to being divided. They're deontological in nature, right? You don't bargain over certain things, such as we often call these salient stakes, right? Like territory, regime change, those sorts of things are things that states tend not to bargain over. And a lot of conflict literature out there tends to focus on the informational shortcomings and how that can lead to conflict. Not all of it, certainly, but a lot of it out there, particularly in the alliances and then in the secret alliances in particular, tends to focus on how private information can make conflict more likely. For instance, some of the stuff I've already talked about, Bass and Shub, they focus on that information and asymmetry there. Carson and Yari Milo, they talk about offstage signaling, using the case of Cambodia as an example. But we know the problem in international relations that never can truly go away is the problem of trust and reliability and credibility, right? And it's going to be most tenuous in secret diplomacy because there's audience costs, right? There's domestic audience costs and international audience costs, and that affects the public and the private reputations of leaders and states in the international system. So like I said, we never truly know if we can trust one another, right? And that's where that commitment problem starts to come in. And that begs the question, are secret alliances informational problems in which one state doesn't know really what the other state is up to? Or are they commitment problems due to issue indivisibilities? So if you go back, and actually part of this, I'm reframing this argument right now, and actually part of this reframing that I'm about to talk about kind of dawned on me when I was rereading some articles for my scientific international relations class I'm currently teaching. And when you think about this argument next to Powell's War as a Commitment Problem article from 2006, he tells us that asymmetric information isn't the only explanation for war. And maybe we as scholars focus on that too much, or even practitioners, one could argue. Or maybe they have the opposite problem. Fearon in 2004, in his article on civil wars, tells us that information may explain how some wars start, but not how they continue in prolonged conflicts. Right? And what I'm going to argue is that states are what they argue as well, is that states are going to defect if the expected payoffs are high and the issues are indivisible. So they're not easily negotiated over. They're not easily bargained over. Some things are all or nothing. Right? And I think critically what Powell says about the first third or quarter of his argument is that assuming informational breakdowns in communication and bargaining games between states can result in some pretty bizarre readings of history. And those are his words, not mine, bizarre readings of history. With repeated interactions between states, the information becomes clearer. Right? I think by 1939, most states out there knew what Hitler was capable of and what he wanted next. It was becoming pretty clear after the remilitarization of the Rhineland, after the Anschluss of Austria, after the Sudeten crisis of 38, the occupation of the whole of Czechoslovakia later on. I think by 1939, it was pretty clear. The question was, how do you deal with that? And that was the main departing point, is how do you deal with someone like Hitler, who you know has designs further east? I think we could say the same for the Soviet Union and the United States throughout the Cold War. When we get further and further into the Cold War, as standard operating procedures became developed between the states. And Ling in his 2000 text also tells us a similar story, both with the Soviet Union and the US, but also with Israel and some of its Arab rivals. How rivalries often take on a life of their own, yet they're predictable because these states are continually interacting with one another. And the information from previous interactions informs us largely of what states want. So that brings me to the point of this argument, which is that given these issue indivisibilities and the problem of defection, secret alliances are primarily going to be a division of goods at the expense of another. Essentially, states want something when they make these secret alliances. They're wanting to get something from another state, right? There's a target. When you go through and you actually read the secret alliance texts themselves and not just look at data sets or read books about them, but you read the alliance texts themselves, one, they're incredibly boring, right? Two, you need to be partially a lawyer to understand some of them. Three, they're also surprisingly short. But it becomes pretty clear that states in secret and in public alliances, they lay out pretty well in a contractual format what it is that they want. But because of that issue indivisibility, that space that is being bargained over and the multiplayer nature of IR, the option of secrecy in policymaking is going to allow states to be able to have a mechanism with which to get what it is that they want. So the theory broadly is that the mechanism at work here is that because secret alliances involve these indivisible goods, things that wouldn't be negotiated over in the first place, and because there's a specific target in mind, secrecy is the key to getting what you want. So often in previous studies on alliances, and especially secret alliances, information has been treated as kind of the end all of the game of secret alliances, and that results in conflict. I'm kind of saying something different here, and that is that information is incidental along the path, if you will, to the commitment problem or over issue indivisibilities, right? So it's a means to an end, right? Kind of like Marx and MCM. It's a means to get what it is that you want. And since that good is indivisible, states have the opportunity to go to a third power in order to maximize the probability of getting that good. Of course, the problem with an indivisible issue like that is that the state trying to get that good is going to have to divide it with another third-party state, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And those goods are often territory. They can be regime change. It can be irredentist claims. There's a variety of different reasons why states might use this approach. So if we're thinking about this visually, we can think about it in this manner, a bargaining game, right? Where state A and state B being the target state, have some good that they're bargaining over. But of course, we see that there is no overlap between A and B. They're diametrically opposed. But of course, we know, taking for granted that IR is a multiplayer game, that state A can approach another state to make a bargain with over this indivisible good. Just because a good, by the way, is indivisible for one side, say state B, doesn't mean that the good is indivisible for another state, such as state A and state C. So that leads me to two pretty simple hypotheses. The first is that states making secret alliances are going to be more likely to identify a specific target state than in public alliances. And the second is that states making secret alliances are more likely to address the division of some good with their alliance partner. So they're going to be addressing both what it is that they want and who they want it from. And of course, here's what those different explanations and different covariates might look like, kind of some of the standard things that we might think of in adding to these models. Of course, the first point I've already talked about, the targeted and division of goods nature of secret alliances. And then, of course, regime type. Regime type, we think is going to matter because we know that secrets are often difficult to keep in democracies. Need I say anything more than WikiLeaks or any variety of other leaks that have gone on out there because of structure, right? And then domestic audience costs, in which case secrecy is often frowned upon within democracies, right? And then also major power status should also matter, as well as a state's share of power in the international system. And the reason we think power might matter is there's a couple of things going on, right? First, a state that has a very large proportional share of power in the international system probably isn't going to need partners in order to get what it wants from a third-party state, right? Or at least they'll feel that they don't need that secret alliance. So it's probably going to be a little less likely when they get larger shares of power in the system. And then also the market for secret or for alliance partners, which is essentially the number of major powers out there. We know from the literature that as there tends to be more major powers in the international system, the system gets more complicated, right? If we want to really look at a multipolar world, we only need to really look up, till immediately before World War I and see how that can complicate things. So we think secret alliances are going to be more likely to bear fruit when there's multiple major powers in the international system. And then, of course, in keeping with what Leeds has argued about information conveyed through different types of alliances, we think that the type of treaty is going to matter, right? It wouldn't make very much sense to have a secret defense agreement. Why would you have a secret defense agreement when half the reason you have a defense agreement in the first place is to signal to a potential adversary that you have an ally's back, for lack of a better way to say it. So we think certain types of alliances are probably going to be less likely to have or to be secret. So first, I'm going to look at this quantitatively, and then I'm going to look at it qualitatively. And actually, that's part of probably what's going to be split into two different papers. So for the quantitative side, what I do is I look at the 4.0 data set from the Alliance Treaty and Obligation Provision data set. And of course, the temporal domain on this is 1816 to 2016. And this data came out about 2 years ago, and they've only had one update since then, but that was actually because of 3 typos. And I already checked those, so that's not an issue here. And the analysis of each alliance text is going to, or my unit of analysis is essentially going to be the alliance member, right? So one entry for each alliance member. So there's going to be at least 2 observations for each alliance. And then the variable is already coded in this data set as to whether or not it's secret, partially secret, or public. And I've not talked about that a lot up to this point, but I talk about it a little bit more in my paper. So there's essentially 3 options, right? An agreement can be completely public, it can be partially secret, like with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or it can be fully secret. And I won't address the methodological issues that might arise from that here, but I address those in my paper. And then the variables are already coded as well for the target state and the division of goods. But what I do is I go back and I rescale for 2 of my models and make a distinction between, those partially secret alliances. I treat them as all fully secret, and then other alliances as public. Right? But then I also do a model where I don't manipulate that primary variable or dependent variable that I'm interested in. Right? So I'm trying to be robust here in how I'm testing this. So that leads me, of course, to a rare events logit model for models 1 and 2. And I also run standard logistic regression models on that as well. And then ordered logit models for the secret, partially secret, and then the public alliances. And of course, I'm going to test this quantitatively with the ATOP data and then qualitatively. So in sum, this is what that looks like, right? The dependent variable is secret alliance, whether that's coded as where I rescale it and look at public alliances versus any secret component. And then kind of an ordered scale, which is 0 for public alliances, 1 for public / partially secret, and then 2 for fully secret alliances. And then standard coding for things like, bilateral alliances, major power, sync scores, democracy, major power count, and the different types of alliances. And then, of course, my primary independent variables of the division of goods and specific threats. So this is what that data looks like. There are 745 alliances total in the ATOP data. Only 14 of those are partially secret, which is, pretty low number. And the number of fully secret alliances is 51. So, so the number of all secret alliances, 5114 is 65. But of course, that's a little bit different for observations because my observation, of course, is the alliance member rather than just the alliance text itself. So that leads me to partially secret observations is 43. All secret observations is 174. So there's about 7.3%, 7.26% secret alliances, or alliances that at least have some secret component to them. There's the descriptive statistics. Again, nothing too interesting there. And here is where we get to the quantitative results. And I won't spend too much time on this. And I have some point estimates here for models 1 and 2, but not for models 3 and 4. I didn't include them in this. So models 1 and 2, of course, are the where the dependent variable is rescaled to, it's a public alliance versus any secret portion or any portion of the alliance is secret, whether it's fully secret or partially secret. And we see a positive effect for specific threat and division of gains for models 1 and 2. Which of course means that I can't reject the null hypothesis for H1 or H2. And this is pretty decent evidence that secret alliances tend to concern themselves with specific threats and the division of gains. So they're targeting a specific state or specific block of states. That is also a coding that the ATOP data indicates. But they're also more likely to address what it is that they want in secret alliances because those are hidden. And that increases the probability that they'll ultimately get what they want. Of course, looking at models 1 and 2, we see they're slightly more likely in bilateral alliances. We also see that as there's more major, if they're major powers, they're more likely to make a secret alliance. Interestingly, though, kind of in keeping with what I was talking about earlier, as a state's power increases, they're less likely to make a secret alliance. That kind of makes sense intuitively. And then when we look at the major power count, as there's more major powers in the international system, states are more likely to make secret alliances. Of course, we see regime type across all 4 models actually is negatively associated with making a secret alliances. Democracies tend not to make as many secret alliances. And then looking down here, kind of in model 2, we see that neutrality agreements are more likely to contain secret portions, whereas non-aggression pacts are less likely to contain secret portions, which is interesting because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact technically was a non-aggression pact. I think that was even in the official title of the name of the pact. Yet it was one of those that had a secret portion or secret part to it. Now, when we look at models 3 and 4, of course, that looks, that's an ordered logit model in which we make a distinction between the public versus partially secret versus fully secret alliances. And we see a similar story here. In fact, the signs, the size of the coefficients, the sample size are all pretty much the same, right, or similar, in that secret alliances are more likely to mention what state is the specific threat and what the division of goods is that the 2 party states or 2 or more party states want to get out of that secret alliance. Of course, we see similar findings with the bilateral nature, the major power status of signatories, their share of power, major power count, regime type, and similar results as well for the different types of alliances. So that's what this looks like for Model 1, right? We see positive effects for specific threat and the division of goods at the 95% confidence intervals. Same here with Model 2 for the specific threat division of goods, right? We see positive effects there. And similar the findings from earlier for neutrality and non-aggression. So put simply, we find support quantitatively for hypotheses 1 and 2 across models 1, 2, 3, and 4 across 2 different operationalizations. And I also did some other robustness checks that I don't present here today. But then we ended up doing a case study as well. And this was actually some good feedback we actually got from a previous reviewer who suggested a case study. Of course, that makes the paper incredibly long when you use mixed methods like this. So I'm probably going to split this paper up into 2 papers and, hope that someone likes the quantitative part and the qualitative part. But the first case that we're going to look at is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed in 1939 between the Soviet Union and Germany, and with, of course, the target states of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the Bessarabia province of what was Romania at the time, as well as some adjacent area actually that wasn't covered by the treaty. And then, of course, the Protocol of Sèvres in 1956 during the Suez Crisis between the United Kingdom, France, and Israel. And of course, the target state here was Egypt. And I won't go through all the justifications as to why we picked these 2 cases, other than to say that they're pretty different, right? One resulted in major war, the other one didn't. One was a bilateral alliance, the other was a multilateral alliance between 3 different actors. In most cases, major actors were involved in these, or major states were involved in these, but Israel was a minor power at the time, was also involved. And both were actually made public later. It's actually an interesting story how they both later became public. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret protocols became public in the end of April, I believe it was, 1945, as a member of the Nazi foreign ministry defected to the West because he didn't want to get caught by the Soviets. And he actually brought a copy that he had hidden away of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And then actually, the more interesting one is the Protocol of Sèvres. It was actually publicly shown on TV, a BBC broadcast for the first time in 1996, because the British and French had actually destroyed their copies of the agreement, but the Israelis did not. And 40 years later, they made it public. But in public, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a reaffirmation of the neutrality from 1926 signed between the Weimar Republic in Germany and then the Soviets. But in the secret protocol, which we found out about later, they designated spheres of influence, right? Which they said, and this is almost kind of hyperbolic, reading it now, in the event of a territorial and political realignment, in other words, invasion, right? The Baltic states would no longer be interesting to Germany. And of course, we know that later the Soviet Union occupied, forced alliances upon the 3 Baltic states, and then later occupied the 3 Baltic states by June of 1940 and had incorporated them into the Soviet Union. And then, of course, we know about Poland, and then the lack of political disinterestedness in Bessarabia, which is actually interesting because Bessarabia at the time had a very large Germanic population, and this being, part of the political, or at least the public political claims by Hitler that he wanted to unite German-speaking peoples. For Germany to say we're not interested in that area, that was important. But of course, the issue indivisibilities here were things like territory in Poland, not to even talk about Bessarabia and the Baltics right now. That problem that had existed throughout the interwar years of the so-called Danzig question, in which Poland was given access to the sea through the Danzig corridor or the Polish corridor, and Danzig, which was predominantly ethnically German at the time, I believe now Gdansk, right? At the time, it was 95% ethnically German. So we know that Poland wasn't going to negotiate on this, right? Even the railways between Germany through the Polish corridor into Danzig had been nationalized by Poland, and actually the League of Nations had agreed to this. So we know that these are indivisible goods, right? This is ripe for a third party to get involved and as a way to change that bargaining space so that that good can be obtained. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we had full information of what Hitler wanted, or pretty close to full information of what Hitler wanted after his activities throughout the 1930s. The question, of course, that confronted leaders at the time was, okay, what do we do about that? And of course, that third party actor, as I said, is going to make defection more likely with those issue indivisibilities. And Poland wasn't going to give these things up easily, right? Because they'd had a hard-fought return to sovereignty. In the span of 12 to 13 years, they had the Polish-Ukrainian War, the Greater Polish Uprising, the Silesian Uprising, Polish-Czech War, Polish-Soviet War, Polish-Lithuanian War. So it's pretty clear that Poland wasn't going to negotiate on this, especially seeing what had happened less than a year earlier, or slightly over a year earlier, with the Sudeten crisis. And Germany ultimately found a reliable partner at these earliest stages of World War II. And they essentially had to have Soviet permission to avoid that two-front war, unlike they were unable to do during the First World War. And that worked for a time, right, until June of 1941. And that actually gave it access to having a shared border with the Soviet Union, to carry out its longer-term policy objectives of the invasion of the Soviet Union. But essentially, we know Germany got less of the pie with Soviet assent. They occupied up to the Vistula River, the eastern portion of Poland, as the Nazi army occupied the western part of Poland. But when we think about the Protocol of Sèvres, it was similar in that there were issue indivisibilities that the states weren't willing to compromise over. So the Suez Canal was nationalized on July 16, 1956 by Nasser. And part of this had extended back 8 to 9 months earlier when the US pulled funding for a dam in Egypt. Egypt recognized the People's Republic of China, Communist China, and they had begun to have closer ties with the Soviets in a way that kind of mirrored what had happened between Cuba and the Soviet Union a couple of years later. And the US was reticent to do anything. And the Soviets were adamantly opposed and communicated very well that they did not want the French, the British, any Western powers getting involved in this nationalization, even though it was clearly in violation of agreements that Egypt had signed, or international agreements that Egypt had signed just a few years earlier. But the reason it was so problematic is that 80% of all of Europe's oil passed through the canal. And to send it a different way around the Horn of Africa made it take twice as long. At the time, it took about a month to send oil from the Persian Gulf, largely from Iran, to Europe. And to send it around Africa made it at best 2 months, sometimes as long as 3 months for the oil to actually get to Europe. So it has aspects of being a territorial dispute as well as being a commercial dispute over a staple product. So we see it's an indivisible issue. Egypt wasn't going to give this up. And it had been a stain on them for some time since they had gained independence, right? A matter of national pride. And the involvement of these third-party actors is going to make the alliance possible. In this case, it was a multi-party alliance. So the plan known as the Chalet scenario was to make it appear that Israel and Egypt were fighting one another, and British and French so-called peacekeepers would come in from Cyprus and invade Port Said and make it look like they were trying to separate the parties. Of course, when this happened, no one really bought it. Everyone knew that something was up, even though the alliance was kept secret. The objectives, of course, for this were fourfold. First was to force Nasser into a war over the canal. The British and French didn't think that putting peacekeepers there was going to stop it. Instead, they wanted to call his bluff. The second was to force the US into supporting the French and the British, which they ultimately did not. The third, kind of, I guess you could say, golden objective was to remove Nasser from power because the British and the French, and particularly the Israelis, were worried about the rise in Arab nationalism at the time. So, of course, the British and the French attack at Port Said. The plan fails. The US won't support it, and the Soviets pretty credibly threaten conflict over it if the British and the French don't withdraw their troops and if Israel doesn't back down. And very few people at the time, if you go back and you read real-time like newspaper accounts of this, really bought the fact that the French and British troops were there as peacekeepers, right? Everyone knew that there had to be more going on to this story than what was publicly acknowledged. The UK even actually said it was going to that it would abandon its ally Jordan if Jordan attacked Israel during the time frame, which is pretty significant that the British government considered this issue to be so salient to them. But it was an utter failure, right? The canal stayed nationalized. It's still nationalized. Nasser ultimately stays in power. Arab nationalism grew. By October of 1958, 2 years later, there was the short-lived United Arab Republic between Egypt and Syria until the coup in Syria in, 1961, I believe. And Egypt and the Soviets grew even closer to one another. Of course, there were domestic setbacks for this. The Eden government directly collapsed as a result of the Suez Canal crisis. And along with Algeria, it helped precipitate the collapse of the Fourth Republic in 1958 for France. So in conclusion, we think there's pretty good quantitative and qualitative evidence for the idea that secret alliances are about getting something from another state, right? So you name that state and you name what it is that you specifically want. And so we found this to be true in quantitative tests. Whether I rescale the data, use the data as it's originally presented to us. I also added temporal constraints that I didn't present here, a few other things, country fixed effects, used standard logit models, and I'm still finding time and time again that these findings are there. And in qualitative tests, we see robust findings in very different cases, right? I could also examine some more modern cases of secret alliances. For instance, one there was coded as the Gulf Cooperation Council. They have secret components to their alliances, but it's actually been kept secret for a very long time, and no one really knows what it's about. But I think what I'm ultimately going to do with this paper is split it up into two different papers. One is a case study, and maybe add another case and trim a little bit out, and then the quantitative evidence, because the length of it is pretty long now for a 10,000 word limit journal. But the key takeaway here is that informational asymmetries are important, right? But can be problematic if we don't consider the fact that these secret alliances often involve issue indivisibilities that states aren't going to negotiate over in the first place. And because of the commitment problem, states always have the option of going to a third party in order to make an agreement. Or in order to get that indivisible good that they want from the other state. And secret alliances are going to be fundamentally about that provision of good at the expense of the other, as we argue. So with that, I think that's probably all I have, and I think I could open it to discussions or turn it back over to Brian.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that talk. Now we can open it up to our listeners. If you have any questions, feel free to, you can either post them in the chat or you can just unmute and start talking. Don't be shy.
Put everyone to sleep. That generally happens.
Oh, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see that.
Yes, I can see that. So thank you for the presentation. Are there policy implications for the results that you got? Do you think modern states may form secret alliances and identify specific threats in the provision of goods? Yeah, so I think those are both good questions. I think the point that I started to make, and I kind of caught myself as I was saying it, I think we as scholars often try to say, informational asymmetry. We don't know what the other side knows, kind of the Rumsfeld, you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. I think that's true for us as conflict scholars a lot. But what I think isn't true for, I think that it's the opposite kind of for policymakers, right? A lot of times they think they have better information going in to a conflict or going into a negotiation than what they truly have. And I think the answer is somewhere in between. And I think, you know, if the implication of this for policymakers is, you know, analyze what has you know, been going on more so between two actors and whether or not there is the ability of that of an actor to make an alliance with another state that isn't public, and how that could affect the bargaining game. And if it's an indivisible issue, that's ultimately going to lead in conflict, right? Rather than just it being an information game, right? And not having the full picture. When it comes to, are there secret alliances still going on? I think there certainly is, right? A lot of the way that Carson and Yari Milo and some of their previous research, with it, they both get about 4 or 5, maybe 2 or 3 of them co-authored secret alliance pieces, ways they try to get around not knowing about secret formal alliances is they talk about secret side agreements, right? Informal alliances, if you will. And I think we know certainly that those still exist. You know, one needs to only look at the news and see that really on, you know, pretty often, that secret alliances still exist, even if we don't know about them and they're unobservable. I think they certainly do still exist. One of the more recent examples, as I mentioned earlier, was the Gulf Cooperation Council Agreement, signed in 2000, I believe it was, which I think has 6 members to that agreement. So we know that there are still secret alliances going on, but perhaps it's best to think of it as there's a lag on the back end, right? We don't always know when those secret alliances start or end. Like the example that I used of a protocol of Sevres, we didn't know that there was, everyone kind of knew, but they didn't know that there was a secret alliance until 40 years later, right? When the Israelis publicly showed it to a BBC documentary.
That actually touches on the question that I was going to follow up on. Do you notice did you notice a shift from in the way that these secret alliances were implemented from the like a bipolar context to the post-bipolar, however IR scholars are now classifying the post-bipolar system? So because you indicated that you know, when you have powerful states are less likely to engage in this sort of you know, dealing. So now that I guess power has been redistributed in certain ways, how do you see this? Do you expect that they would proliferate in this new environment, or? But it sounds like you're saying that they become less common.
I think that's a good point, in that I've not really thought about it. That might be another version of the paper, because I actually kind of like that argument, right? That I think there's multiple reasons why they're less likely today. I mean, this was even one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, right? Get rid of secret diplomacy. Of course, the problem is that every state, even in informal talks, always assumes secrecy, right? When they're talking with another state. It's just there's not a formal agreement that necessarily comes from it. Do I think formal agreements are still out there? Yes. Have they kind of fallen out of fashion with, I could also use structural, I think you offer kind of a structural explanation, the shift away from kind of bipolar worlds to, you know, a more multipolar world, which I think is becoming a bipolar world again. I think we would see a continuation of that maybe in the future. I think the world in which we see secret alliances being most likely is in multipolar worlds, right? Because from what we know from kind of, if we're, you know, to talk about the isms from realist thought, those multipolar worlds are the least stable. And if one state can get another state to flip in a multipolar world to being on their side, it's going to really tip the balance in their favor. That was the kind of the agreement, or the Treaty of London, right? In 1914. When the Italians were offered side payments of, hey, you can get part of South Tyrol and part of what's now Slovenia from Austria-Hungary. Oh, and we'll actually give you money to do this if you join us. So they defected from their alliance with Germany, I believe at the time, to join the Western powers. So I think that's certainly that they're still out there, but there's structural as well as internal domestic explanations where we're less likely to see them, mainly democracies. Right? But yeah, no, I think that's a great question. One that I've not really thought about, though.
Okay, anyone else have a question?
I have a question.
Please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I kept thinking about associations between states and non-state groups. So, for example, there are alleged reports that Turkey used the Islamic State to counter Kurds, or, for example, there was a report recently that Russia used the bounty hunting techniques by using Taliban. Um, and also there are reports about, for example, Pakistan using different non-state actors in Kashmir and in Afghanistan. So is there a mechanism, I mean, can this mechanism also explain the dynamics between states and non-states group? And also, for example, if the data is not available related to states and non-state groups, what could be the indicators for the research if someone is interested in that?
Okay, so for the last part, let me answer the last part first. I think qualitative analysis would be best for kind of answering that part about why states might make agreements, secret agreements with non-state actors. One, they don't have the prestige. Two, it's just difficult to find that sort of thing out. Actually, it might be easier now that I think about it, as kind of the ebb and flow of the relevance of of non-state actors kind of subsides. A state might have an incentive to, or a press within a state might have an incentive to publicly announce, oh, hey, this secret alliance happened between the US and ISIS or something like that. But I think, I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question again?
So can we even use alliance for state and non-state actors because of the legitimacy concern?
Yeah, I think we can. And I think that this is the hardest case in which to show that, right? That I use these formal alliances, because there's a lot of negotiations that go into creating these formal alliances, and it's kind of a high bar to jump over. It's not like just normal kind of negotiations between two friendly states or marginally friendly states or even enemy states, right? We know these side payments happen all the time in international relations, but to see them actually written down on paper in formal alliances means that this should be the hardest place that we should find it, right? So I think they probably do exist between states and those non-state actors. It's just, getting at that data is going to be exceedingly difficult. And that's why I think a qualitative analysis would get one better at understanding that. And that's why I also did mixed methods here. It creates too long of a paper, which of course creates its own problems. But there's an observation problem with secrecy, right? If something is an unobserved behavior, by definition, how do we know it happens, right? This is kind of that conundrum that political scientists in the US are facing right now with, allegations of voting fraud, right? And I am by no means an expert on, how do you determine whether or not fraud happens or doesn't happen? It's a criminal activity. Therefore, it's very difficult to determine whether or not it's real or not. And it's therefore non-falsifiable. So I think secrecy within the formal alliance kind of text, it's difficult to get at. And I kind of rely on that within my paper. I use the other papers that have used these quantitative approaches as a crutch to say, hey, they've done it, let me do it now with a different question. I think it would be considerably harder, though, with secret alliances with non-state actors. But I think you could do it qualitatively. But yeah, that's an interesting question. And I hadn't actually thought of that either with non-state actors.
All right, anyone else? Please feel free to ask. I suppose I have another question. Do you have a sense of how? I mean, these are it's behaviors between single states, but do we have any evidence that that these type of alliances happen between security blocs like NATO or things like that? Do they function in a similar way or?
That's interesting, and I've not thought about it amongst like security blocks, so almost like a network effect of how they interact with, say, other networks. I think that we'd probably be, 7% of my or 7.3% of the observations or whatever were secret alliances. I think if you went to look at that from block to block, it would be even smaller, because we know that there's problems with secrecy, right? And the bargaining game if you add more players to the game. If you have 5 kids and you bake one pie, each of the kids gets a smaller sample or portion of that pie, and they're more likely to argue over who gets what part of the pie, as opposed to if you have 2, right, when they're going to get too much. And then we also know substantively, secrets are harder to keep amongst groups of 3 or 4. There's kind of the old joke, about like, how does every murderer get caught? Well, they tell someone, right? How do secret alliances get caught? Invariably, when you go back and you look through how they ended up going public with the secret alliances, it's because, there was a defection problem within the state. Someone eventually came out and told that was a secret member to the alliance, or states, after they had gotten what they wanted, they just kind of, made it public, like, yeah, we don't care. There was a secret alliance, whatever. So I think it would be hard to see or to observe, at least amongst blocks of states.
I guess as a follow-up, that do you think that secret alliances would be more likely among those within a security community, in the post-bipolar realm, or so what I'm asking, I guess, if there are these defection problems, is this where you would expect to find secret alliances in the current kind of multipolar context?
I think what you were kind of talking about earlier, at least intuitively, and I've not really thought much about this question, it makes more sense that one would see secret alliances like you were talking about earlier, maybe across state blocks, maybe from NATO to like one NATO member with, like a Warsaw Pact member or CSTO member, whatever, versus within the bloc, right? Because the idea of if you kind of buy the literature from the 1990s about security communities, the idea is that there's a degree of trust built in between them, and that secrecy would be unnecessary, at least for the interests or the claims that I'm talking about. There's another component of secret alliances that I didn't really talk about, I only talked briefly about, and that there's domestic reasons why states might want to have secret alliances, right? They don't want to be embarrassed. And that could actually help describe maybe a little bit of the French and the British version of the Protocol of Sèvres, especially more the British than the French or the Israelis at the time. And it certainly, I think, explains why there was a secret alliance between South Africa and Swaziland in the 1980s, because it wasn't about a division of goods at the expense of another. And here I am, of course, undercutting my own argument. There it was more concerned with what is the domestic audience going to say if we get caught doing something that looks bad. And that's kind of that on-stage, off-stage signaling game going on.
Okay, anyone else? I think it's the sign of a sealed tight argument that you have.
I wish. Can I ask all of you to be reviewers for me then and recommend an immediate acceptance?
Well, I suppose if no one else has any other questions or comments, then I guess we can wrap things up. But last chance for anyone who has a comment or question. All right. Well, I guess that's that. So thanks again for presenting, Matt, and tune in next time in November. We'll have our next speaker. I'll be sending out an announcement for that very shortly. So thanks for everyone for attending today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Great. Thank you.